summer of 2025 marks the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, of the final surrender of the Axis powers. And I've come here to the Imperial War Museum in London to look at some astonishing objects that shed light on that vital year in our history.
Acting as my guides today are curators Anthony Richards and James Taylor,
Hi Dan.
who have hand-picked a number of very special artefacts from the museum's collection.
Well guys, thanks for having me at the museum. And this is one of my favourite places in the world. And just coming in here, I'm very struck by the fact, actually there's a real 1945 flavour to this hall, isn't there?
There really is. And so what we've done today is we've chosen 3 objects that really speak to the year 1945.
By the start of 1945, the Axis powers were on the brink of total collapse. Faced with inevitable defeat, they responded not with pragmatism, but with desperation. Determined to do everything in their power to slow the Allied advance, hoping somehow to turn the tide of war. It was against this backdrop that they turned to ever more extreme tactics and weapons, a final gamble in a conflict spiralling out of control.
Well, I'm just looking at some of these weapon systems, unimaginable 6 years before in 1939. I mean, we have gone through, it's the biggest and bloodiest war in history.
This is it.
And the weapons are like things out of science fiction.
Yes, they are. So behind us, what we have the V2 rocket, so the world's first supersonic ballistic missile, and also a Japanese suicide plane.
So interesting, that's the suicide plane now?
That is, okay. Yeah. So that's purpose-built to carry the pilot to essentially his death, and hopefully, as the Japanese see it, destroy a US warship on the way.
And that V2 there, first man-made object to enter space, almost as a sort of a side effect of World War II. We're already entering the space age.
This is it. I mean, these things climb 50 to 60 miles high and reach a top speed of 3,600 miles an hour before the fuel is cut out, and then they come down like a conventional artillery shell. So this is part of a wider campaign that the Germans engage in. It's pure revenge, nothing more. And so about 10,000 people are killed by the V1, its predecessor, and the V2. This is from June 1944 right through to the end of March 1945. That's when the last V2 falls, 6 weeks before VE Day.
It's interesting that 1945 isn't a sort of postscript. It really is building to a climax. The second one just seems to get bloodier and more intense every month that goes by.
It does. I mean, the levels of violence are extraordinary. From September 1944 to May 1945, 3/4 of the total tonnage of bombs dropped on Germany during the war is dropped in that 8-month period. So that gives you some idea of just how catastrophically violent the war has become.
And speaking of catastrophically violent, Tony, we've also can just about see here the casing for an atomic bomb, again entering just a new era of human history.
Yeah, almost in the same field of vision, we've got the atomic bomb and we've got the V2, and looking at the scale of that, I always find it's incredible to think that that was fired where we are now in the middle of London. In fact, there are photographs of the corner just outside the museum where a V2 landed and killed several hundred people. So it really brings it home to you, that level of devastation that both sides were sort of seeking right at the end.
You know, whether it's the Manhattan Project in the US to create atomic weapons, whether it's the V weapons program, these are some of the most expensive research development projects ever undertaken, and they're all being used in these last few months of the war.
80 years since the end of the Second World War. The Imperial War Museum is home to millions of artefacts relating to the conflict, including a handful that offer unique insights into those final desperate days. Standing at the centre of this incredible collection is perhaps the most instantly recognisable. One of Hitler's infamous wonder weapons, the V2 rocket.
So Dan, this is the V2.
I mean, standing down here, I was about to say it looks space age, but it actually is. This is the dawn of the space age.
It really is. I mean, this was a supremely advanced piece of technology, but it comes too late in the war to turn the Nazis' fortunes.
When this was being used in 1945, just give me a sense of how it compares to bombs that were being dropped in 1939.
Well, I mean, if you look back, I mean, everything's kind of like, the conventional, bombs that are dropped from planes, many of them quite light. But then by the end of the war, you've got this thing. And from September 1944 right through to the end of March, an average of about 7 a day of these things are landing on London.
And they're faster than the speed of sound.
They are.
You can't shoot them down.
No. I mean, the first thing you know that one has struck is the explosion. And that's followed by the sonic boom.
Wow. So you can't hear them coming.
No, you can't. I mean, I think what's really interesting about the V-weapon offensive, so the V1s that come before and the V2s, is that they cause absolute terror in London. 1.5 million people leave the city. So such is the effect.
You associate that with the beginning of the war, don't you? People going to the
you
countryside and all these kids. Actually, that was going on at the end of the war as well.
It is. And I think the other very grim fact about these is that the V-weapons kill as many people, slave labourers, working on them in underground tunnels in Germany as they do in Britain.
And the nightmare scenario was that Hitler's nuclear physicists would be able to put a nuclear warhead, create a ballistic nuclear missile, which sadly did follow the war quite in short order.
It did, because of course the tube alloys programme, the British nuclear programme, followed by the Manhattan Project, there was this fear that the Nazis were developing their own nuclear bomb. And in fact, that goes on, it explains some of the savagery of the Allied bombing towards the end of the war as well. What else have they got that we don't know about?
It must have been scary. When these started landing on London, you think, well, what else?
Yeah.
And although we now know what happened, it could have turned the course of the war. If they'd had enough of them and they were.
Yes. I mean, they're one of a number of German, wonder weapons that come in towards the end. You think of the Messerschmitt 262 and other jet fighters, the Type 21 U-boat and so on, but they can't produce them in the numbers and they don't have the fuel.
Well, thankfully. Hitler hoped that weapons like this were going to turn the course of the war.
He did, but he hoped they'd be ready before any Allied invasion of Western Europe and would turn the tide. I mean, it's complete fantasy. The thing is that at the same time, you've got a lot of the German armies in northwest Europe are horse-drawn because they haven't invested the resources in the right kind of technology. They don't have jeeps, for example. So they don't find the practical solutions to practical problems. They simply try and create something that's going to turn the course of the war like that.
It's a desperate gamble.
It is. It's a gamble, and it doesn't work.
Do you see a similar desperation on the part of the Japanese, just trying to find some new weapon that will give them an edge, stave off defeat?
You do. I mean, if you're looking, in early 1945, it's absolutely clear that Japan is losing the war. On VE Day, when people here are marking and celebrating the end of the war against Germany, the Americans, and indeed a British Pacific fleet, are fighting in the Pacific around Okinawa. And one of the things that they're facing are weapons like these, kamikazes.
Human bombs, kamikazes, were Japan's final gamble to try and turn the tide of war in the Pacific. Drawn from the ranks of the many young Japanese pilots who'd been trained but were lacking serviceable aircraft and munitions, they were sent on suicide missions against Allied ships in waves of attacks.
The kamikazes cause absolute terror among the Allied sailors and airmen. But the thing is about them that, they are quite successful. About 20% hit their target,
really?
So destroying or damaging warships. And this is a really interesting example of a kamikaze because it's purpose-built. So it's an Ohka, which means cherry blossom, and we can see the cherry blossom motif on the side there. Its construction is largely of plywood and wood.
So it's really lightly built.
It's really lightly built. What happened was that this was transported towards the targets underneath a Mitsubishi Betty bomber, so a heavy bomber. The pilot comes in to the cockpit as they approach the Allied fleet, and then he's dropped out, he glides towards the target, and then there are 3 rocket boosters at the end. He'll fire 1, 2, or 3 of those as he accelerates towards the target. So there are about 750 of these built. We know that they only undertook about 50 missions, but 7 ships were sunk by them. And I think, again, if we're looking at Japanese desperation, they fear an invasion of the home islands, and so they have about 5,000 kamikaze aircraft ready to repel that invasion. They've kept them back.
So you can do some maths there. If you assume about 20%,
Yep.
that's a lot of ships getting sunk.
It is a lot of
if that
ships.
invasion had taken place.
It is a lot of ships. It's a very sad story, though, I always think,
Tragic.
that these people were prepared to do this.
And one interesting fact about this particular Ohka is that when the museum acquired it and we had to undertake a lot of conservation work on it, we stripped some of the paint away, and inside it had a Japanese figure which meant 100, and we think that that was the 100th one that they constructed in the factory. And they were so proud of the fact that they got to that point, they marked it especially.
Again, given the massive armament production going on in the Western world, the Western Allies, that's quite pathetic.
So it tells you something about, you know, the lack of materials and
Yeah.
that level of desperation that they had.
The Ohka serves as a stark reminder of those desperate last days, a glimpse into Japan's final futile attempts to resist defeat and the terrible human cost of a war in its closing moments. But desperation wasn't limited to the Axis powers alone. The Allies too were urgently seeking any means to bring the conflict to a swift end.
So British Commonwealth heavy bomber here, you get a sense just from this front section how big these aircraft were.
Absolutely. I mean, this is essentially a flying bomb bay. Arthur Harris, the head of Bomber Command at the end of the Second World War, he said that the Lancaster Bomber, like this, was the most decisive contributing factor to the Allied victory. There's no little exaggeration
He would have said
there.
that, wouldn't he?
But what is true is that Lancasters were heavily involved, particularly from September 1944, with the resumption of the combined bomber offensive in pushing through that final defeat of Nazi Germany.
By the spring of 1945, German skies were filled with Allied aircraft. A seemingly endless stream of bombers and fighters sweeping across the Reich. At the heart of these devastating bombing campaigns was the workhorse of the RAF, the Lancaster Bomber.
They're involved not only in area bombing of cities, but also supporting troop movements. And I think it's really interesting, perhaps the one episode of those last months of the war in terms of the bomber offensive that we think of immediately is the bombing of Dresden in February 1945. And ironically, it wasn't really an area bombing attack. What was being done, there was this idea that we would support the Soviets by bombing the city, which hadn't really been touched before. Obviously a beautiful city, but there were loads of refugees streaming westwards from other parts of Germany. And also the Allies' worry was that this would enable not only troops to go and support activities on the Eastern Front, but go and help build what was being seen as the Southern Redoubt, this last stand of the Nazis, which, I mean, Nazi propaganda, they'd fallen hook, line and sinker for it. This wasn't really going to happen. But nonetheless, the consequences are tragic, as we know. 25,000 people are killed in Dresden. And there is a firestorm, just like there'd been in Hamburg nearly 2 years previously. So the human cost is immense. It's reckoned that between September of 1944 and May 1945, half the German civilians killed in the bomber offensive are killed in those months alone. And I suppose we should also remember that the cost for the bomber crew was also very high right throughout the war. We can see here the roundels painted on the side. These mark 49 missions.
Wow.
The average tour that a bomber crew was supposed to do was 30 missions. You had a 1 in 10 chance of surviving those. So doing 2 tours, 1 in 40 chance of survival. So 55,000 out of 125,000 bomber crew are killed over the course of the war. It's nearly half.
As Allied bombs smashed German towns and cities, and Nazi defeat grew ever nearer, deep in his bunker in Berlin, the man at the heart of it all prepared for the end. What happened in those final hours is greatly debated, but one surviving document gives us an extraordinary insight into his last moments.
I think when we think about the end of Hitler and the end of the Nazi regime, in a way there's one document which really perfectly sums that up, and it's the one that we actually have here today, which we'd like to show you. So this is one of the copies of Adolf Hitler's final testament, which is the final document that he put his name to.
Wow, you got it in the museum? I didn't know that.
So there are actually 3 copies in all, which all had different purposes. But really, what the testament was Hitler's opportunity to establish his place in history and to justify why he hadn't won the war and why the Third Reich was basically in tatters around him.
So it's more than just a will?
Absolutely. It was really a justification of how he had fought the Second World War, but also why it had failed. And it's, in a way, it's supremely ironic because Hitler, of course, was a soldier in the First World War. And at the end of the First World War, when Germany lost, the soldiers blamed the politicians. But here, you'll see that it was actually Hitler, as the politician, blaming the army who had let him down. So each testament it's kind of in 2 parts.
And he dictates this just hours before he takes his own life, doesn't he?
Yeah, so this particular copy, there were 3 copies in all. 1 copy was sent to Field Marshal Schörner, who was the head of the army. The second copy was sent to Admiral Dönitz, who was going to be the new head of state. And the third copy would end up with the Nazi Party archives in Munich. So this is the one that was sent to Schörner, and this is a covering letter. But if we go through it, it says, "My political testament."
That is something else, isn't it?
And he starts straight away talking about the First World War. Yeah. You can see, because there's the reference to 1914.
Straight away in the first line, yeah.
And if we make our way through the document, this is where we come to he's apportioning blame. So he's saying Hermann Goering has let him down, but also Himmler. Both of them had been trying to seek or negotiate peace with the Allies.
Yes, they've been manoeuvring, haven't they?
So they've been manoeuvring behind the scenes. You really get that sense of disappointment at what he calls their treachery, because they've been trying to negotiate a peace behind his back. That thread of disappointment in them and anger runs through the whole document, and it keeps coming back to this sort of feeling that he's been let down and it's the fault of others. So even, right to the end, Hitler was utterly delusional, really.
So you have to pinch yourself here. This is being created in the last hours of Hitler's life, isn't it? He's dictating these words as they're being typed out.
And according to witnesses who were in the bunker at the time, the course of events were that Hitler married Eva Braun, and it was a very sort of short, simple ceremony. And immediately afterwards, he went into a room next door with the secretary and dictated this there. She took it down in shorthand, which was actually very unusual at the time, and perhaps indicates the state of mind he was in by wanting to get it all out onto paper as quick as he could. But then she typed it up and presented it to him. So if we move to the end, we can see where he signed it, and it's dated the 29th of April 1945 at 4 in the morning. Wow. The signature's quite interesting because you can see it's a very distinctive sort of, you have to read it on its side almost, as sort of an A Hitler. But if you compare that signature here, which is basically the final example of his handwriting, if you compare that to something much, much earlier in the war, you can see how the handwriting has deteriorated. And it's witnessed by Dr. Joseph Goebbels, Martin Bormann, his private secretary, Krebs and Bergdorf, who were the generals who were there as well.
These signatures, they're sort of ghostly, aren't they? And at least, do they all end up dying really alongside Hitler? They all end up taking their own lives?
Absolutely, yes. Oh. So I think that the first one would have been Dr. Goebbels, who of course was there in the bunker with his whole family, so his wife and his 6 children. They poisoned themselves shortly after Hitler himself had committed suicide. And yes, the generals committed suicide afterwards. Martin Bormann, of course, sort of mysteriously disappeared, but was found many years later to have also lost his life.
That's an astonishing artefact, isn't it? Document.
And if we go back, this page is where he's deciding who's going to take over the various roles. So you've got Dönitz, who will be the new head of state, interestingly not referred to as the Führer. Dr. Goebbels, who of course actually committed suicide himself a few hours after this. So yeah, Martin Bormann, who of course disappeared shortly afterwards. So a lot of these appointments never actually came to pass.
Why is he even bothering to? Germany's on the brink, days away from catastrophic defeat. Why sort of start to say he's going to follow me? This is the Reichschancellor, you know?
Well, I think Hitler himself realised that he wasn't going to get away. That was it. He was going to die. He'd already decided. In fact, he talks about it in the Testament how he's about to take his own life. So there's no doubt about that. But it was important to still have some kind of structure to the Nazi regime to go forward, if only to make sure that as many troops and personnel as possible could surrender to the Western Allies rather than the Russians, because then there was a greater chance of survival. And that's what Dönitz eventually did, that his job as the head of state really was to kind of delay the negotiations as long as possible so that more and more people could get to the West.
As I'm looking at this list of government ministers, that expression, on paper only, it's only on, well, what a great example. This is a German government that exists only on paper.
Absolutely, yeah.
Half of them were dead or captured by the time this was even.
And the actual document itself, of course, never ended up with where it was supposed to go. Yeah. So in a way, it's symbolic of that pointless end, I suppose.
So what an incredible document, what an incredible link with Hitler, but also what an insight into his thinking, one of the history's most consequential, one of those evil leaders, hours before he took his own life. Astonishing.
And it's amazing that these copies survived, really, and ended up in an archive like this one.
Of everything I've seen, it's this document that provides perhaps the most chilling window into the closing days of the war. A terrifying insight into Hitler's mindset as he's forced to confront inevitable defeat.
So this document, it leads quite nicely from the one we were just looking at, because again, it's a document that very much symbolises the end of the war. And this particular one was the first surrender for Northwest Europe. So although the Germans had surrendered in Italy already, this was very much the document which meant the end of the war for Britain. So all those troops who had landed on the beaches of D-Day the year before, this was the end of their war. The end of their war in many ways.
So Hitler's gone now, and days later, the German forces surrender. Germany is surrendering.
Absolutely, yes. And what's interesting is the folder it's kept in, because this is all in the handwriting you see of Montgomery.
Amazing.
Monty was such a meticulous character, and all his papers, which we look after here, are all beautifully catalogued by the man himself in little folders like this.
An original copy of the surrender document, which he himself was present for, Lüneburg Heath, 4 May 1945. Nicknamed Monty, Bernard Montgomery was one of Britain's most famous generals, a career soldier who'd fought in the First World War and went on to play a decisive role in the Second World War, with famous victories over the Axis, including the stunning Second Battle of El Alamein in Egypt in 1942.
Yes, Montgomery of Alamein, FM, Field Marshal. So there's the actual document.
That's amazing.
And of course, it's signed by the 5 Germans who were there at Lüneburg. The main signatory is von Friedeberg, who was the German naval officer who had been sent there by Dönitz to negotiate the surrender. And then, of course, we've got Monty himself, who has signed it. Interestingly, he got the date wrong and has had to cross it out and put the correct date and initial it in case there's any queries.
So it's instrument surrender, all German forces, Holland, Northwest Germany, all the islands around, and Denmark. So really the whole of Northwest Europe. And I love it, they've written in, because they've typed it all up, and you can tell this was done by the army, because then someone in the Navy's gone, hang on lads, Battle of the Atlantic's still going on. This to include all naval ships in these areas. I love that.
It's one, I love the little sort of handwritten amendments, and there's a change to the time there.
You can see Montgomery going, yes, just all these troops and tanks surrender to me, please. And some naval guy going, hang on, mate.
Absolutely. And there's wonderful descriptions in Monty's memoirs about the whole ceremony, because part of the signing was to almost humiliate the Germans, I think. And so they came up with this whole idea of making them wait outside Monty's tent until he was ready, and then he would sort of usher them in. And there's a wonderful description where he says one of the German officers was obviously very nervous, and he was sort of fiddling around and got a cigarette out and was about to light it, but then Monty caught his eye and frowned at him, and he put it away quickly, which tells you everything you ever wanted to know about Monty.
So we've got Friedeberg here, who is the head of the German Navy, very briefly at the time. Who else have we got?
The 5 German officers, headed by von Friedeberg, who signed the surrender. And again, like with Hitler's testament that we looked at earlier, all of these officers will be dead within the next month or so.
Take their own lives.
Yeah, which again, tells you about the sense of disappointment and the sense of futility that they would have been experiencing at that point, where they knew it was the end, really, for their regime.
And perhaps nervousness about what the future might hold, whether there'd be victor's justice meted out and they want to take their own lives rather than face execution. Yeah. Well, there it is. What a document, written down there in ink and mixture of type and longhand.
These documents, together with the weapons and aircraft on display, take us into the final weeks and days of the conflict like nothing else can. They're remarkable pieces of history, offering unparalleled insights into the death throes of the Second World War.
What an extraordinary thing to have these documents in your collection.
It's a great privilege, actually, because, I try not to use the word iconic because I think it can be overused quite a lot. But these things, they are really. They've got a certain power about them, I think.
Such a privilege to have it.
It is, and like the V2, like the Ohka Kamikaze plane, and like the Lancaster, this document can be seen in our galleries at IWM London.
Well, thanks for inviting me in, guys.
Pleasure.
Pleasure.
Those galleries and objects and manuscripts really helped to sharpen my understanding of exactly what went on in 1945 and why it really matters, those last few tumultuous, bloody months of this global war. And you can find out more. Tony's written a book, 1945, go and check it out. Or, of course, you can come here and visit the IWM. Always a good idea.